Good morning. My name is Elaine Wilson, and I'm here to talk to you about a lot of really fun things. They all revolve around the name of the artist, Alexander Calder, who liked to go by the nickname Sandy. This is one of the pieces that he did, which is a fish tank. I won't be discussing it, but I will in the lecture, but I did want to point it out to you because it's a form of wire sculpture that he invented. Now, a little bit about the man's past is always helpful, and also kind of where we're going with this lecture. I'm going to be talking about sculpture and stay-bills. I'm going to be talking about mobiles. I'm going to be talking about some of his jewelry. I'm also going to be discussing cars and airplanes because his life was definitely multifaceted when it came to creating art. He came from a family of sculptors. His grandfather, Alexander, had immigrated to the United States from Scotland and was lucky enough to land the job to do the sculpture of William Penn that sits in Philadelphia on the top of City Hall. And if you've never been close enough to look closely at William Penn's face, you can see it right here. And I doubt very much that except for a pigeon, anybody else would have seen this. However, he was a very fine sculptor. Now, as far as his family was concerned, he and his wife had a son whose name was also Alexander. And he was living in the Philadelphia area, was a young man, and his wife, who had studied, this would be Alexander's mother, who had studied in France, came back to the United States and was studying art in Philadelphia. They met, got married, and they became the parents of Alexander Sandy Calder. So this is number 3, Alexander Calder, that we'll be discussing today. Alexander Calder's home was really just a huge sculpture studio and a painting studio because his mother was a very prolific, very talented portrait artist, and his father had many commissions with his sculpture. When Sandy was a young man, his parents tried to, and successfully did, encourage him to do something besides study art because they just didn't think he would have a very good life-sustaining quality of life career as an artist. So he decided that he would study mechanical engineering. He didn't know what it was. He'd heard somebody talk about it, and a man that he very much admired said he was a chemical engineer. So he studied chemical engineering at a school in Hoboken, New Jersey. And that doesn't end up being any part of his active career. He is not employed as a mechanical engineer ever. However, he does use, during his growing up years, he does use his imagination to make things. Now you remember, he was born in 1898. So at the early turn of the century, finding things on the street, pieces of string, wire, corks, different kinds of things. He would bring those home and he would create his own imaginary objects from those. By the time he was 11 years old, he was proficient enough with working in metal that he made Christmas gifts for his parents. And the bird that you see here is actually kinetic in that it rocks. It will rock back and forth. And his sister, he had an older sister, and his older sister had dolls, and so he would use these found objects from the street and fashion different kinds of jewelry for her dolls to wear. When he got to be about 10, 11, 12 years old, his family, first of all, his father had contracted tuberculosis. So for a while they lived on a ranch in Arizona, and then they lived in Pasadena, California, and then they were back in Philadelphia again. They moved around based upon the commissions that his parents had. But they always provided a studio workshop for Alexander in the basement of the family's home. By the time he's 26 years old, he's in Paris. He has studied his chemical engineering degree, but he's decided he really wants to be an artist. And he goes to Paris, where everybody was studying art and becoming artists at that time, 1926. So he is in Paris and he bumps into a number of men and women, but men that will become very popular, very famous as time went on. And one of them is the man named Petit Mondrian. Petit Mondrian did not start by making these huge square-like compositions with primary colors and black and white, but he evolved into this. This particular piece by him was done in 1921. And when Calder visited his studio, he saw this piece and he saw a number of other pieces. And Petit Mondrian's studio was completely white. White furniture, white rugs, white curtains, white everything. And so the paintings that he did were very dramatic and on the walls. And Calder looked at them and he said, you know, I wonder what would happen if those colors moved. Now Mondrian didn't pick up on that signal, which would eventually become Calder's mainstay and way of life. But what he did is he said to Alexander, well, I paint fast enough, I don't need the colors to move. However, this becomes what moving colors becomes what Calder will do. He tried painting. After he visited Mondrian's studio, he tried doing paintings. He tried circulars and circles, and he tried cubes, and he tried, it looked like lollipop trees, but painting just didn't give him a lot of joy. And so instead of painting, and here's another one, called The Ray of Light in Dark Times. And here you have the light shape behind the dark. He still wanted to do what he had thought of in Mondrian's studio. He wanted his colors to move. While he's in Paris, he locates a place where he can have a studio. And if you think this is cluttered, you have seen nothing yet. Wait just a little while and you'll see what his studio in the United States ends up looking like. However, in 1926, along with meeting Mondrian and other later important artists, he met a man from Serbia who was a toy maker. And the man said to Calder, you know, you ought to try making toys. You are always working with wire and things. He said, why don't you try making some toys? Well, his mother was sending him $75 a month, so he had enough money to live on. So he thought, I'll do this. And then once he got all of these little objects made, and you'll see some pictures of them because the Whitney Museum in New York City has this entire circus collection. He came up with this poster. You're invited to a presentation of Calder's circus, and then when it was going to be. And this is how he carried the circus to the site where he was going to have the performance. And if you notice, he had to charge admission because he needed a little more money to live on. He had to get some supplies. Everything couldn't be just picked up off the street. And the suitcases were all numbered, and these suitcases were dearly loved. Look, some of them don't have their handles anymore. This one has one, but they're just, this is how he carried his circus around from when he was in France and also when he was in the United States. This was another poster that he did, and notice his colors. His colors will be like the colors of Mondrian. His favorite colors were red, blue, yellow, white, and black, and that's what's here. And here you can see him planning the circus. There's the trapeze artist, the horse, the ringmaster, the clown, the bare-chested lady. Everything is there, and everybody is in the process of having a good time. Here's what the circus looked like. This is only a part of it. This was a 3-ring circus. If you bought a ticket to his performance, you were there for 2 hours, and he manipulated every single thing that happened to make the circus work. Now you see the horse? The horse is laying on its side in the upper one, and over here it's raised up. He had contraptions attached to these figures. Look at this one. There's something here. Over here, do you see this string that comes up here? If you pull in the string, the flag unfurls. If this coil was put on top of a spindle, which would be a hole underneath this plywood board, and then he had a crank that ran over to that, this little bucking bronco would buck and run the whole way around the ring. So he had really created some interesting animation. I point out the cowboy here because he not only is a fascinating little figure and he has a lariat that he's going to be lassoing something with, but he's wearing chaps. And those chaps, that fabric, you're going to see that fabric on 3 of his other critters that he creates. Let's take a look. How about the lion? The lion's mane and the lion's tail are made out of the same fabric that the chaps on the cowboy were made from. Now, what is a lion and a cage without a lion tamer? And so here you have the lion tamer, and also you see there's a string here, and then there's a wire that goes up here. You pull on the wire, and this comes up, and that's the whip to get the lion into position. There's the lion. And here, this picture gives you a couple of pieces of information. First of all, you'll notice that what he's doing is he's looking up here at his trapeze act. And I also included this for you to see because it gives you some idea of the scale of these figures. That lion's cage was not that small. If you look at the width of his shoulders and the profile on the cage, there's a similarity there. Here is his bandstand. There are some of his acrobats. There is a clown. I watched a video yesterday. The clown was in the video, and the clown is wearing actually 12 layers of clothes. And of course, the outside of the chaps and the mane are the same as what the clown's coat is made of, the sleeves of the coat are made of. But he uses this clown to the point where the clown is just down to his little striped pants and the suspenders that hold them up. But look, every single thing is here. I've been to the Whitney and I have seen this seen this circus. Not in action, of course, but I have seen it, and it absolutely is so spellbinding that you could just spend hours there and still not see everything. Here, this man balancing a plate. Here is a man balancing himself on top of another man's head. Here's a man going around on a bar. There are just things everywhere. So you can imagine how exciting it was for people to go to his circus and how he was able to help support himself while he was there. More than 70 of these pieces are moving. Some of them are not. If you notice here, these are pieces that are included with this. This is one of these men that throws knives and hatchets and medieval pieces of equipment. But this man would move, but here are some of his accessories. Here's a broom. It has cleaning up peanut shells over here. There's the bar that comes across, and the trapeze would fit under there. All of this is something that you would have seen at the Whitney. There's the lion again. And the lion has some springed parts on it, so the lion's head will turn and his tail will go up. And there's the cage that he goes in. You see a better view of it. Alexander Calder is one of the few people that I know in this world who didn't carry anything in his pockets like a pen or pencil or a piece of paper, but he carried pliers and a roll of wire, because if he thought of an idea, that's how he presented it to himself. And here you have examples of 3 of his wire sculptures. Yes, he invented this idea. After he did, it's been used so much we forget that he's the one who did it first. but I'm going to put numbers on these pieces. So we have 3, 2, and 1. And those numbers represent how many different wires it took to construct each one of the figures. Look at this. This wire comes down, makes the feet, comes up, flips around, makes the wing, goes back up, and finishes the tail. Over here, he would have started in this area and come around here, put the ears on the donkey, and then gone back here. And then gone around and around and around and around and up and hooked that over his neck. And if you notice, the tail has a spring shape behind it. And the spring shape means that the tail would swing. So it has a kinetic look to it. The elephant is a little more complicated. The head is one piece. The ears are another piece of wire. And then the whole body is the other piece, and everything is attached to itself up there. He didn't solder. He didn't use a lot of glue. He actually used wires to support or to connect to other wires. Very, very little extraneous equipment. He would use brads of some kind to stabilize animals that would be sitting on blocks. But this little guy, this little bird, doesn't need anything. And his chemical or his mechanical engineering background is good because he has a great sense of balance with his work. Whether it's that or here, here's the lady. Now this piece is interesting because it's a lady running with an umbrella. And the lady's head or body, upper part, is a light bulb. He has taken some of the wire and taken the casing off the outside of it so that there's a variety as you look at this. Some of it is the white coating and some of it is the actual wire. He also did this piece. This is another one of these pieces. Just like the bird, it's made out of one single wire. And then up at the top, he attached this string with the bar. He found pieces of glass and he made a face out of it. And the face, depending on the breezes, the face will move and turn. The features will do that. I told you not to be too concerned about what you saw in Paris. Here is his studio in Roxbury, Connecticut. After he and his wife were married and had lived in France for several years, in 1933 they came back to the United States to buy property and to settle. They didn't have much money, and so what they did is they bought a property in Roxbury with a tumble-down house, farmhouse, 18 acres. It had a barn and it had an ice house, and this is part of the ice house, but he also, this is part of the barn, this became part of the barn area too, but he certainly exaggerated that to get as much height in there that he needed and also the light. But look at the collection of things. And if you think that's bad, take a look at this. It's a different angle on his studio in Roxbury. I would take out an extra life insurance policy to walk into a place like that. But this man knew everything that was there. He loved tinkering around in there. All of his design ideas either came from there or they came from his studio that he had in France. He and his wife will eventually become successful enough with his career that they can afford a home in France and also a studio over there. But as he works on these pieces, he has some organization to it, brushes in here. He has some sticks here. There is some organization to it, but not something who a person, his name is not Alexander Calder, could easily understand. Here's one of his mobiles. Now he came up with this idea that things could spin in the wind. He had tried using a motor on some of his early pieces that he suspended, and he said he got bored with them because the motor just made them keep doing the same thing over and over again. And he didn't like that. So he thought it would be better if you could suspend something from one piece of string, and keep in mind the weight on these is enough to counterbalance what's going on over here. So this thing doesn't hang crooked. It hangs the direction that he wanted it to be. But all of these different parts are hooked together, and all of them will spin individually as they catch currents of air. So his art becomes part of his training in college at Stevens Technical School in Hoboken. It's part mechanical engineering, and it's also part art. But notice that he sticks to his favorite colors. Here he has black and red and yellow used. And where does he get his ideas for his shapes? His shapes come from nature. He looks at flower petals. He looks at fish fins. He looks at birds. He's looking at organic, natural organic shapes, and then adapts those and works with the size and the balance to get the construction so that it hangs, a mobile hangs by a single thread, rope, chain, whatever it happens to be. He called these large ones constellations. He said, you know, I don't see anything wrong with using art, sculpture, and moving it, because look at the universe. The universe is the creation to end all creations, and everything in the universe spins and moves and turns. So why can't man allow art to do the same thing and enjoy it? Here's another one that he did, and this is what he said actually. Why must art be static? The next step in sculpture is motion. And here he is in his studio in Connecticut, working on establishing the balance that he needs. He's holding this. He has an armature that comes out here. This one comes down, it goes this way. This is over here, then there's one here, there are two over here, this balances this way, and everything has to balance perfectly, and then move and not be throwing itself off balance. So his sculptures, his mobile sculptures, mobiles, were definitely feats of creativity at the highest level in order to make all of this work. Now notice the sculpture, the mobile that you see there, and the tail on that. That tail is large, and it is large so that it will counterbalance with the other end, and then these pieces are smaller. He used metal, he used aluminum, he used a variety of different materials, but you'll notice with this one, the shape that doesn't move is the star. The star will stay the same. The other shapes will all rotate around it, almost as though it's a sun. And he said, if you can compose with colors, you can compose with motion. And this is what he is doing when he's creating his mobiles. Somebody asked him one time, do you have a lot of fans? This is sort of odd work. Nobody had ever done it before. Do you have many fans? He said, oh yes, I get lots of fan mail. Everybody's under 6 years of age. How many people have seen a child in a crib with a mobile strung above their bed? And the children love it. Children enjoyed his work very, very much. That's not what made him famous, but it certainly was something that made him realize that his work could appeal to many people, and many of us lots of days wish that we were under 6 and sometimes act like it. So he really had a lot of fans, a lot of fan mail. He was well liked, he was highly respected. As much research as I've done on him, I've never read anything or heard anything about him that was derogatory. Easygoing and easy to get along with. This is what he did for Seattle. This is called Seattle's Eagle. And if you look in the background, you can see the Space Needle back there. His stay-bills, which do not move, they are in perfect balance. They do not move, and they are all made out of steel. And he would make a small one in his studio, and then Any stay bill that he did was enlarged absolutely to a fraction of an inch to scale to make the large one that would be someplace in a public setting. He's the artist that really started public art. The National Endowment for the Arts gave him a grant one time, and it just seemed to take off. A lot of artists have used that source, funding source, to create public art since that time, but he is probably one of the earliest or the first. This is an interesting piece. This is in Mexico City. The Olympics were held there in 1968, and they wanted him to do a sculpture for outside their stadium. And so he did El Sol Rojo, which means red sun. And of course, there it is, and it's on a tripod shape, 3 legs that come up. Notice something else. This piece is huge in comparison to the people that are underneath it. Look at the scale. This is his, or was his, largest piece at 67 feet tall. And also notice where the arrow is pointing. The arrow is pointing to the blue patterns. Each one of these legs sits in a blue circle. And then that circle is enlarged and enlarged and enlarged and keeps going out till that blue design encompasses the stadium. And it all springs from one well, and that's his sculpture of El Sol Rojo. I love this picture, and I just thought you had to see it. Look at that little guy standing beside Alexander Calder. That's his grandson. And his work is going to be uncrated, and they're watching that happen. And the actual piece of work and the model that it was created from is on the ground between him and his grandson. When he did these pieces, they were all shipped perfectly flat, and they were all put together with predetermined rivets. Nothing was slapdash when they got to the site. Everything was well planned. But this is just a darling picture of him with his grandson, watching them uncrate the huge piece that is modeled after the small one that he did in his studio. Chicago has several of his stay bills, and one of them is called Flamingo. This gives you an idea of the studio size model, and then this gives you an idea of the scale of the final installation. And why a red flamingo? He knew where this was going to be situated, and he wanted to make it a contrast to all of the dark, stark buildings that surrounded it. And so I think he was successful. This piece moves and flows, and this is very stable going up this way. But it's in a huge center in Chicago. Once these pieces were installed, they didn't move, and they haven't moved. They've stayed where they are. This piece is 53 feet high, and talking about moving, it weighs 50 tons, that metal that he's using. He worked hand and glove with the foundries to create the huge finished pieces. Nothing was left to chance or to adjustments once it got on site. And it's red, and you've seen a couple of other pieces that are red. The red is actually vermilion red, but it was nicknamed Calder red because the steel was made red. It was dyed red so that these never have to be painted. All you have to do is probably wash them down once in a while to get any dust or soot off of them. But aside from that, they are what they are, and they stay where they were put. This was presented to the public in 1974, and he will die suddenly, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, in 1976, the year of our 200th anniversary for the United States. But this piece, he made so many of these, and these were small, and he could work on several commissions at a time, make the small piece, get the foundry engaged in it, and go off and start to work on some more. This is an interesting one that he did in 1967 for the Expo in Montreal. It's actually 3 discs. You can see in this photograph 2 of the 3. But it's actually 3 men, and there are 6 posts that support this, which are the 6 legs of the 3 men that are there. This is a different angle of that same sculpture. And here you can see one of the heads, and down here you see another one, and the other one would be back behind this. And the legs are down in this area. Now you look at these and you say, well, how would anybody ever know who did them? Well, I'll point that out to you in just a minute. A couple of dimensions for this though, 65 feet high and 72 feet wide. And like a sculpture ought to do, a sculpture is different from any other art form in that you should be able to enjoy it from any angle at all. You should enjoy the back, the front, the sides, underneath, on top. And his sculpture meets all of that criteria. Someplace on every single sculpture that he did, he has signed his work. And there's an A and a C and the year. And that was done at the foundry as well. It's not scratched into the metal. It's actually a little bit of raised area so that each one of his works is personally signed. He loved to make jewelry. I told you he did that when he was small. He made jewelry for his sister's dolls. And so he made jewelry. He made at least, I read last night, he made over 2,000 pieces. I wrote down to be safe, I put 1,800. But he loved to make jewelry. And he had his wire with him all the time, and he had his pliers with him. So instead of doodling on a pad, he could work on a piece of jewelry if he felt like it. He made everything. He made pins, he made earrings, he made necklaces. Mostly he worked with metal. He worked with bronze. No, he worked with silver and gold and copper, mostly. Some other metals as well, but his preference was silver or gold. But here's a piece that he did with string and with wood. And there he is in another part of a studio. This was not the studio where he did the massive sculptures, the stabills and the mobiles. This was a different place, and you can see behind him, he has wires strung up with earrings that he's already made on them. And you know he has an anvil here and a hammer. He loved to take wire, and if he wasn't threading it around through itself, he liked to pound it flat, like he has done here. A lot of this is pieces of wire that he has pounded flat. And again, he's used metal rivets to fit these together. So the person who wears the earrings is actually wearing 2 miniature mobiles. Sometimes his work was a little dangerous. This is one of the pieces that he did. I look at this and wonder, how does she put on a coat? And if she doesn't wear a coat in the summertime, isn't that a little scratchy? However, it's a very imaginative piece. It's all made out of metal. And the woman is sitting, you can tell, very still, not moving, while the photographer took the picture of him with it, of her with it. He had lots of friends that were famous and had wonderful wives, and sometimes he would treat the wives or other women artists to some of his jewelry as gifts. This is one piece that he did as a gift for Georgia O'Keeffe. That's a brooch that he made for her, and if you look, you can see it here. The curious story about this is he made the brooch in bronze, and she wore it, but then her hair turned gray, and she said it didn't match her hair anymore. So she found a jeweler in Taos, New Mexico, who remade exactly the same pin. And notice how she chooses to wear it downhill. I have actually seen this pin, and it is probably a good 3 or 4 inches across. It's not little. So wearing it down probably was easier, and she just liked the design. But folks, it's all made out of one piece of wire. And then wrapped around the outside piece is the pin part that goes over and hooks back in here, and that's it. Just 2 pieces. And this wonderful spiral design, he'd love to work with spirals. This piece has an interesting current history. In 2005, it was sitting on a table with a bunch of junk at a flea market in Brooklyn, New York. A woman who knew something about jewelry and about Calder also happened to just brush by the table and looked down and saw that and just wondered if maybe, even if it wasn't a real Calder, maybe it would be just fun to have. So she bartered for it and got it for $15, and the $15 turned into that much money. It's original. It's all made out of his wire, pounded flat. A wonderful piece. Now this is his wife, Louise. He met Louise in 1920, around 1928, 29. He was going back and forth between, he was living in Paris because he got there in 1926, going back and forth to see his family. And she was on a boat with one of her uncles, and Calder was walking the deck in the morning to get some exercise, and he walked by this young woman with this older man, and he thought, well, you know, that's got to be his daughter because she can't possibly be his wife. She's much too young. So he thought, well, hurry up. So he sped around the deck and he went by again, and as he went by that time, he heard the man say, "You see, there's one of them." And Calder thought, oh my gosh. He thinks that I'm just out to get anything I can get, and that's not the case. I just think that girl's beautiful. One thing led to another. Her last name was James, and she was the great niece of the writer and the author, whose last names were also James. And they will eventually be in Paris together, and he will, all of his life, he will, for important events, he will make jewelry for her. But this piece is especially interesting. Right here. That's her engagement ring. It's a piece of wire wrapped around and around. In 1930, he wanted to ask her for her hand in marriage. And he was in Paris. He had no money, but he had a piece of wire. So he took the wire and he pounded it flat and he made it into this wonderful ring. And he asked her to marry him, and he said, and I have an engagement ring for you. And he gave her this ring, and it fit her finger, and she was properly appreciative. But then she said, you know, I'd really like to have a regular engagement ring if we can find one somewhere. Well, they went to a Paris jewelry store, and it's 1930, so things are not as expensive as they are in today's world. And so for $2, they bought her an engagement ring, a real traditional engagement ring. But as you notice, her hair has gotten gray in this picture, and the engagement ring is long gone, but the original ring that he gave her is not. She wore it all the time. This is an interesting photograph because it's 3 examples of his work in one space. There's a stay-bill, there's a mobile. Now notice what happens. Outside, how can you attach something to the sky? You can't. So you have to make a stationary shape that will then support the armature that will balance out the mobile which will then spin around on that. So that's how he handled outside sculpture when it had to do with mobiles. But he's standing in front of an interesting car, and there are 4 men behind him that are looking on and smiling. They seem to be happy about the car. This is what the car actually looked like in full color. It was a BMW, and it will eventually run in the 24-hour Le Mans race. And the interesting thing about it is that he has again used his blue and red and yellow and black and white colors on it. And notice, just like his large sculptures, his staybills, he has his signature on it, his A and his C. These are different men, but they are the owners of Braniff Airlines. And Braniff Airlines went to Alexander Calder and wanted to know if he would be willing to design the skin for an airplane for them. Well, he thought that was just crazy. And then he thought about it again, and he said, "No, well, let's have a talk about this." The car was good because the car was like moving art. Now he said, yeah, maybe we can do something. So what they did, there's Calder and his wife, and Betty Ford was the era was pointing to before. She was there to make the official presentation. There's the plane all painted. And this is the model that he worked from. That's the plane that he painted. And then that was then painted, that design was painted on this airplane back here. Here's another one. They ordered 3 from him. He will only live long enough to finish 2. But it's curious that when they decided to accept his designs, they realized that putting their name, their airplane company's name on the side of the plane would just not work. So they let him sign it. He has signed it up here. He has signed it down here. He's not going to sign the model, but he did sign the outsides of the planes. And sometimes, here's the plane flying. And this one was called the Flying Colors of the United States, and it was to celebrate the 200th year of the anniversary of our nation. And sometimes he would actually take his hand and go to the place where the plane was being made and actually paint on it. Now, this is his drawing. You can see he signed that. And he's working from this idea to do this particular design on the side of the plane. This is the one that would fly to South America. Braniff decided that this was really turning into quite an interesting marketing ploy for them, so they asked him if he would do a poster for them as well. And so he designed this poster, you see. His name is here. And then those weren't just handed out to any old person. You had to be a travel agent who was using the resources of Braniff Airlines for their customers and be using them quite frequently before you would be gifted with one of his signed prints, because they were all signed. If you get yourself into a travel agency someplace, even in this area, and you see one of these posters someplace and nobody is paying much attention to it, you might want to consider just asking them if it's for sale, because no matter what you pay for it, it's going to be worth a lot more when it gets to a collector's place, because this was a limited edition on this poster. And it was an important poster because it represented Braniff Airlines, and they only flew until 1982. This airliner, interestingly enough, ended up in a movie. It's no longer around because it was in a hangar in a movie, and at the end of the movie there was this scene where everything was blown up. The name of the movie escapes me at the moment, but everything gets blown up, including the hangar and the airplane. So the airplane met its death in the hangar, being blown to pieces, but it flew regularly for a number of years. I just think it'd be wonderful if you got famous enough that the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. would take a room in their East Wing and just call it yours. This is the Calder Gallery at the National Gallery in the East Wing of the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. And there's a picture of Calder up there in front of one of his sculptures. Looking at this piece, you can see there is a mobile up here. There are a couple over here. You can see them with the color. And then there are also some stay bills, some smaller ones. These are not pieces to be designed to be used outside. But one of the curious things about a mobile is not just the actual shapes themselves, but the shapes that they create when they dance and move around with the currents in a room, fans or the movement of people, and the designs that they make on the wall. Notice how some of these have holes in them. And those holes are necessary because they help to maintain the balance of the piece of sculpture. Some of his stay bills are 7 feet tall. So these are not just little guys. It's like the circus wagon that you looked at earlier. These are not all real. There's a small one, but some of these are pretty decent size. This is his final commission. He didn't mean it to be. He wasn't going to quit work and retire, but it does end up being his final commission. He is designing a huge mobile that the National Gallery wanted to put in the atrium of their museum in the East Wing. Here is some idea of the scale. Look at these men. And these are some of the pieces that are going to be attached and hung from the ceiling. Look at the size of the hooks that hold them together, and the scale that they're on, and the care that they're getting. Nothing is hitting the ground. You walk into the entrance to the East Wing and look up, and there it is. It is huge. In fact, it is interesting because it was built, the large one, to scale, was built by Paul Matisse. I have lectured to you before on Henri Matisse, and it would be his grandson, who actually was the one who was commissioned by the National Gallery to be responsible enough to follow the exact design idea of Alexander Calder to put this together, because by this time Calder had died. Paul Matisse had this enlarged 32 times its size. So this piece of sculpture is 85 feet across, and it weighs 920 pounds. I don't know about walking underneath it. I have, and I'm sure it's on a cable that is very, very, very very supported. But this huge piece moves around. Some of the panels are blue, some of them are red, others are black. But this piece moves around because they didn't use on the mobiles, where the stay bills, they used steel. With the mobiles, they used lighter metals. And in this case, they honeycombed shapes, and then they surfaced the shape on both sides with aluminum. And the aluminum that they used, and it's no wonder the men in the previous slide were holding it so gently, had to be paper thin in order for this to go up and then move with the currents in the room. And all of the rods that you see here are aluminum rods. So this is actually made out of aluminum, but it weighs 920 pounds. In his college yearbook, they always had quotes about what everybody's future would be or what they were about. And they had underneath Alexander Calder's photograph, they had a quote something like, Sandy is always smiling, and if the expression on your face is an idea of the countenance of your soul, he has a wonderful soul, because he is always very happy, and he seemed to want to stay that way intentionally, not just for the history of the yearbook, but you can see him here walking across the street with a mobile over his shoulder. And he said, here, yeah, what happened? No, I don't get sad. If I start to feel sad, I just go to sleep. I get over it. You don't want to do that. Everything that he did revolved around his universe and our universe. His works dot the world. They are in France, they are in Venezuela, they are in Canada, they are in the United States, they are in England. There are many, many places where you can find a Calder sculpture, either a stay-bill or a mobile. The idea for the word mobile came from one of his friends who came to see him in the studio when he was making them. He said, what is he going to call that? And he said, I don't know. He said, this thing keeps just moving around. He said, well, why don't you call it mobile? Like motion, it moves. And Calder thought, oh, that was clever. I think I'll do that. Well, then another friend came by, and he was working on another piece, and it was one of the stationary ones. And he said to him, what are you going to call this? It's not like a traditional sculpture. And Calder said, well, I don't know. He said, Arp gave me the idea to call the first one, the ones that moved, just call them mobiles. Guy said, well, it's called a stay-bill. It just stands still. It's stable. Yeah, that'll work. And that's how the two names got into our English language. That's how they became known as Calder's, really his inventions. The creator of the earliest mobiles, stay-bills, and never forget his amazing circus. If you have time sometime, Google this name and take a look on YouTube, and you'll find one of his circus performances and get a good cup of coffee or a nice glass of wine, and then just sit there and watch for an hour and be thoroughly amazed and amused at how wonderful and magical he made his circuses. He did find joy, and I'm hoping that today with this lecture that I have brought some of his joy to you. He is a man who was, as I said, well loved, highly respected, esteemed all of his life for the wonderful things that he did. He was affable, easy to work with, easy to be around. A good father, a kind husband. He and his wife had 2 daughters. Town and Country magazine did an article on their home in Roxbury, Connecticut in 2017. And the girls who own the property, it's not public and you can't go there and walk around. It's 18 acres. But the house, the editor from Town and Country was allowed to go to the house and to be there for a meal and watch Louise cook and just kind of hang out. And for some reason or other, I missed that article in my Town and Country magazine and didn't get a chance to see firsthand what it looks like, but I did see some slides of the house inside yesterday. And the curious thing about it is that the house kind of looks like a cleaned up studio. I mean, there are things hanging in the windows, things hanging on the wall. He designed rugs, and Louise would hook the rugs. He designed all kinds of interesting things. One time they needed a skimmer to get the cream off the top of the milk, and he made one out of sterling silver. One time they needed a toaster and didn't have one, and they were out there in the country, and so he designed a toaster. He was always making things. He was always tinkering. He was always doing things like that. At the end of his life, he had attended a very important opening of his work at the Whitney Museum in New York City. And he came home. It was in November of 1976. He came home out of nowhere. He had a heart attack and he died. So he didn't suffer. He didn't suffer with any long-term illness, and he died very happy. He had contributed amazing happiness to many people in the world, and I have a guess that's going to continue. Now, if you have any questions for me or any comments that you want to make, remember that you can always get in touch with Willow Valley at their website, or if you want to just get in touch with me, that's fine too. You can email your questions to me at my home email address, which is laineyLW@gmail.com. You can comment, you can ask questions. I'm sure some of you who love his work have probably wondered where some of the pieces are that you didn't see. Quite frankly, it's very difficult to try to compress into 1 hour the life of such an incredible man, and who contributed so much in so many parts of the world to so many people. And so I did the skimmer thing. I just skimmed off the surface, just give you a taste of some of the fantasy, some of the fun, some of the construction issues, and a little bit of a window into the life of an amazing American 20th century sculptor. Thank you very much.